I never thought my life would turn out this way. My name is Angelica, and this is my story. I was born into a family of farmers, simple but incredibly kind people who always believed in the power of hard work. From the moment I learned to walk, my parents introduced me to a world where each new day was filled with caring for the land, animals, and our home. Mornings on the farm began before the sun even peeked over the horizon. My mother and I fed the chickens and milked the cows, while my father worked the soil, preparing it for the next harvest. Evenings ended around the family table, where we shared stories from the day. Our life was simple, yet it was full of warmth and comfort. For me, school was a small window into the world beyond the farm. Like all the village children, I went to school, returned home, did my homework, and then plunged back into the endless chores on the farm. On weekends, I couldn't even dream of walks or entertainment. Every minute was dedicated to helping my family stay afloat. I knew no other life and, more importantly, I didn't long for one. The farm seemed to be the only possible place for me to live. Everything changed the day I graduated from high school. During dinner that evening, my father, a calm and reserved man, initiated a conversation that would change my life. "Angelica," he began, looking at me over his cup of tea, "your mother and I have talked, and we think you should go to college. You have the talent and skills that could open up new opportunities for you." His words struck like lightning out of a clear sky. I could barely imagine life beyond our home, but his confidence made me think. A few months later, I packed my things and left for the city, which felt like a completely different world. Bustling streets, endless rows of buildings, people hurrying about, it all overwhelmed me with its novelty and, at the same time, frightened me. College wasn't just a place to study, it was a door to an unfamiliar life. The lessons were interesting, of course, but it was my interactions with other students that completely changed my perspective. The people I met dreamed of things I had never even considered. That's when David came into my life. It happened during my second year. He was charming, confident, and, most importantly, nothing like the boys from my village. David seemed to embody the new life my parents had spoken of. He claimed that life was short and meant to be lived to the fullest. His words were music to my ears, and before long, our relationship became my top priority. We started dating, and within a few months, we were talking about the future. When I brought David to meet my parents, they greeted him with caution. My father, after listening to his stories about city life, muttered, "He's a nice guy, but something about him makes me hesitate." I chalked it up to his old-fashioned views. To me, David seemed perfect, and I had no doubts about our future. My parents approved of our relationship, even helped pay for our wedding, and bought us an apartment in the city. I promised myself I would make them proud. That was the beginning of my new life. 2 years after our wedding, I became pregnant. The news filled me with joy, an almost magical confirmation that life is full of unexpected gifts. I felt wrapped in the warmth and care of family once again. My parents, upon hearing the news, squealed with delight over the phone. "Oh, Angelica, we're so happy for you." Their voices brimmed with excitement and pride. David's reaction was far more reserved. He mumbled something like, "A baby? Already? Well, I guess that's fine." His words lacked the enthusiasm that was bursting in my heart, but I attributed it to nerves, reassuring myself that he would embrace the role in time. As always, my parents spared no time or resources to support us. They bought us a car to help us manage the challenges ahead and even paid for a vacation so I could relax before the baby arrived. I was deeply touched by their generosity, but David took it for granted. "Of course they're helping us, they're your parents," he said dismissively one day. Suppressing a twinge of irritation, I agreed that he was right. When our son, Massimo, was born, the world seemed to transform. That small, warm miracle in my arms filled my heart with a new and profound love. As I looked at him, I saw a purpose that now connected all my days. To David's credit, He tried to be a good father, but it seemed like the sleepless nights and endless cries were especially hard on him. "Can't you get that baby to stop crying?" he grumbled, tossing and turning in bed. "Some of us have to get up early for work." I bit my lip in silence, reminding myself that parenthood was a new experience for both of us and that we were still adjusting. We tried to visit my parents as often as we could, but with each trip, David became increasingly reluctant. "Your dad asked me to help with the tractor again," he grumbled, stretching out in a chair with a glass of wine. "I'm not a mechanic, for God's sake." I watched him fumble with tools next to my father, who patiently explained how to fix the equipment. David grimaced at the dirty parts, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was really trying or just pretending to make an effort. But everything changed soon after. A year full of sorrow took both of my parents. They were gone. I was crushed by grief. "David, they're gone." "I can't believe it," I sobbed, burying my face in his shoulder. He patted my back, trying to be comforting, but his words stunned me. "Well, at least they left us the farm." This phrase struck me like a dagger. The farm wasn't just land or property, it was my family's legacy, a part of their soul, their labor, their love. But David saw it only as an asset to be used for his own benefit. "We need to sell the farm," he said one evening as we sat at dinner. "We could buy a big house in the city and live like royalty." I wanted to object, to defend the memory of my parents, but I didn't have the strength. The bitterness of loss and the exhaustion of motherhood had drained my resolve. "All right," I said quietly. "If you think that's the best decision." With just a few signatures on some documents, my family's history was handed over to strangers. The money was deposited into our joint account, and David beamed like a child in a candy store. "We're set for life, Angelica," he exclaimed, smiling. "No more backbreaking work. We can do whatever we want." I nodded and smiled back, trying to hide the emptiness tearing at my heart. Everything I loved had been sold to fulfill David's dream. And as his wife, I felt obligated to support him. Life after selling the farm did change. David and I cut back to part-time work, and it seemed like our dream of a carefree life had come true. But soon I began to notice changes. David, who had never been particularly ambitious, now completely lost any sense of motivation. He quit jobs easily, complaining about the management or inconvenient schedules. "David, we can't live off the money from the farm forever," I tried to reason with him. But he just waved me off. "Relax, Angelica. We're set for life. Just enjoy it." David's words sounded far too carefree, but deep down, I sensed that this ease was deceptive. Years passed, and Massimo grew up quickly. He finished high school, then college, and before I knew it, he was working and living on his own. I was proud of him, but at the same time, the house felt hollow without his presence. One day, while flipping through the morning paper over a cup of coffee, my eyes caught a bold headline. It was an article about a thriving concrete factory, owned by David's uncle, Robert. I called out to my husband. "David, did you see this article about your Uncle Robert?" He turned to me sharply, his face darkening visibly. "I don't want to hear about that old tyrant," he snapped with an unexpected bitterness that froze me in place. I had heard the story of Robert many times, though its details now seemed unclear. David often recounted how, after the death of his parents, he ended up under his uncle's care. According to him, Robert was a domineering and cold man who tried to impose his rules and force him to work in the family business, disregarding David's desires and dreams. "He never cared about what I wanted," David had said many years ago. "All he cared about was making sure I continued his legacy." Now, looking at David, who sat on the couch in a bathrobe, lazily flipping through TV channels at 2 in the afternoon, I couldn't help but question how truthful his version of events was. Maybe it was time to reconcile with the past. "David, it's been years," I said cautiously. Maybe it's worth trying to talk to Robert. People change. His reaction was explosive. Reconcile with that control freak? Never in my life, Angelica, he practically shouted. Drop it. His face contorted with anger, and I decided not to press the issue further. But a doubt had been planted in my mind. Why was there so much rage in his words? What else was hidden in this story? A few days later, I overheard David on the phone. His voice was cold and irritated. I don't care about his life, and it's none of my business, he snapped before hanging up. My curiosity couldn't go unnoticed. Who was that? I asked. The hospital, David muttered without turning around. My uncle's sick. If he finally kicks the bucket, maybe I'll get something out of it. Those words made me freeze in place. David, that's a terrible thing to say. He raised you. Yeah, and he made my life hell, David replied in an icy tone. I'm not going to see him. End of story. Watching him settle back into his chair with the TV remote in hand, I felt something inside me break. The man sitting in front of me was no longer the person I had married. Without saying a word to David, I went upstairs, grabbed the phone, and called Massimo. Hi, sweetheart, I began, trying to keep my voice calm. How would you feel about meeting your great-uncle? Massimo was surprised but agreed. Within an hour, we were standing outside a hospital room door. The ICU greeted us with the quiet beeping of monitors and the hushed voices of staff. On the bed, surrounded by machines, lay Uncle Robert. His face, pale and gaunt, bore no resemblance to the tyrant David had described. Hello, I said as Massimo and I stepped inside. Robert opened his eyes and looked at us. His gaze filled with warmth. Angelica. Massimo, he said weakly. I've wanted so much to meet you. For the next hour, Robert shared his side of the story. He spoke about how he had taken David in after the death of his parents, how he had tried to give him everything he could so that he wouldn't lack anything. I love that boy, Robert said, his voice trembling. I wanted him to have everything, to continue the family business, to live a good life. But David, it seemed, had other ideas. Robert continued, his voice shaking as he recalled those events. He told me he didn't want responsibility. He didn't want to worry about the business late at night, like I did. He didn't want to work as hard. I felt something inside me break. Those words painted a picture that felt painfully familiar to me, like the final brushstrokes completing an image I had long been missing. David demanded that I sell the business, Robert went on, shaking his head. He asked me for a monthly allowance, an apartment, a car. He said I owed him a carefree life. I glanced at Massimo, who was sitting beside me. His face reflected shock, and I realized my own feelings were no less intense. Life doesn't work that way, Robert added, his voice firm despite his weakness. Money has to be earned, not demanded. I begged him to stay, to get involved in the business, but he only grew angrier. He said he'd find a rich wife and never have to work again. Sitting in that hospital room, surrounded by the quiet beeping of monitors, I felt the pieces of my own life starting to come together. Memories rushed over me like waves, one after another. I recalled how David, even before our wedding, would often talk about the importance of freedom. How he took endless days off under the pretext of stress. How he preferred part-time work, insisting that life was too short to spend it on hard labor. But now, these fragments formed a different picture. I realized that David hadn't married me for love. To him, I wasn't a wife, I was a means to an end. My background, my parents' generosity, their support, those had attracted him more than I ever had. He chose me because I embodied his dream of a carefree life. Robert's voice brought me back to reality. I'm so sorry, he said, his gaze filled with regret. I wanted to leave something for you and Massimo, but there's nothing left. I hope to change that, but I've run out of time. I squeezed his hand. We don't need anything, I replied. Thank you for everything. Suddenly, Robert's face contorted in pain, and the monitors around him began to beep urgently. A nurse rushed into the room and asked us to step out. A few days later, the call came. Uncle Robert had passed away. When I told David, his reaction shook me to my core. Finally, he exclaimed, a smile spreading across his face. The old ___ held on long enough. I stared at him in disgust. David, he was your uncle. He raised you. He dismissed me with a wave of his hand. Yeah. So when's the funeral? Do I have to go? In the end, he didn't go. Massimo and I organized the funeral ourselves. It was a quiet, modest ceremony, which I hoped to conduct with enough dignity for Robert to be proud, even in death. As I mourned, remembering a man I had barely known, David stayed home. When I returned, I heard his voice coming from his office. The factory has to be worth at least 10 million, he was saying on the phone, his voice brimming with excitement. Can you believe it? I'm rich. I stood in the doorway, watching as he paced around the room, gesturing triumphantly. Every move, every word filled me with revulsion. The man I had once married now seemed like a stranger, a foreigner in a familiar body. But the worst was yet to come. You know, Angelica, David said one evening, his voice laced with a coldness I couldn't ignore. You're getting a bit old for me. I think I'm ready for an upgrade. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What did you just say? I whispered, feeling anger and pain rise within me. David shrugged as if he were discussing something trivial. You heard me. I'm rich now. I can do better. His words were like a knife twisting in my heart. I stared at him, unable to believe that the man I had spent so many years with was capable of saying something so cruel. But he showed no shame. David started coming home later and later. Night turned into early morning, and the smell of alcohol and unfamiliar perfume lingered around him more and more often. Lipstick stains on his collar became a regular occurrence. Every time I tried to talk to him, he brushed me off. Stay out of my business, he'd say. You should be grateful I come home at all. One night, I lay in bed listening to him stumble into the house at 3 a.m. I couldn't take it anymore. I finally realized that something had to change. I deserved better. But more than anything, I wanted the truth. The next morning, after another sleepless night caused by his drunken arrival, I couldn't stay silent any longer. Where were you? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though it trembled with anger and pain. David looked at me with bloodshot eyes, squinting. It's none of your business, Angelica, he said, his words hitting me like a slap. You should be grateful I came back at all. I stepped back, feeling the crack inside me deepen into an unbridgeable chasm. Are you serious? Is that really how you see our marriage? He ignored my question. Instead, as if he didn't even notice the state I was in, he asked, how much is left from your parents' inheritance? We should have some savings, right? The sudden change in topic caught me off guard. David, we've spent it all. The accounts are empty. His face twisted into a grimace of disgust. Empty? You must be joking, he snarled, pacing the room, muttering under his breath. Then he stopped and turned to me, his eyes cold and soulless. Well, I guess that's it. I'm done here. Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Massimo walked in. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. David's demeanor instantly shifted, his face lit up with a fake smile. Massimo, my boy, he exclaimed. Just the person I wanted to see. He approached our son, pulling a document from his pocket. I need you to sign something for me, he said, handing over the paper. It's just a formality. You're waiving any claims to Uncle Robert's estate. There's no will anyway, so everything falls to me. Massimo glanced at me, clearly confused. I nodded, trying to reassure him, and without hesitation, he signed the document. David's smile was triumphant as he snatched the paper back. Then, as if flipping a switch, he turned to me. All pretense vanished. I want a divorce, he announced, his voice cold and steady. I never loved you, Angelica. I only tolerated you because of your parents' money. But now I'm rich, and I don't need you anymore. The words hit me like physical blows. I had suspected it for years, but hearing the truth was unbearable. I'm moving into Uncle Robert's house, he continued, already pulling out a suitcase. Don't try to contact me. It's over. And just like that, after 30 years of marriage, my life was packed into a suitcase that walked out the door. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. My legs felt rooted to the floor, and my mind refused to accept the reality. Mom? Massimo's voice was quiet, but it carried a note of alarm. Mom, are you okay? I turned to him, seeing the concern and worry in his eyes, and felt something inside me break. Tears streamed uncontrollably down my face, and in that moment, Massimo pulled me into his arms. It's going to be okay, Mom, he murmured, holding me tightly as if afraid I might fall apart. We'll get through this. You're strong. You'll make it. I sobbed into his shoulder, feeling the weight of weeks, months, years of tension finally crashing down in bitter tears. At the same time, I realized what an incredible man my son had become. Kind, compassionate, everything his father wasn't. You're the best thing he ever did, I whispered through my tears, and Massimo only held me tighter. In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, I wasn't alone. I had my son, and together, we would face whatever life threw at us. The weeks after David's departure felt like walking through a fog. Pain and disbelief wove together into a dense veil that made it hard to think clearly. I tried to keep my head up, convincing myself that moving forward was the only way. But it wasn't easy, especially when David decided to flaunt his new life. At first, it was just pictures on social media. The new house, a mansion that had belonged to Uncle Robert. My new home, the captions read. Then a young woman began appearing in the photos. A blonde, beautiful, barely older than Massimo. In one of the pictures, David had his arm around her, smiling at the camera. The caption under the photo knocked the air out of me, "Meet my fiancée, Katerina. The upgrade is complete." My phone began ringing non-stop. Friends, acquaintances, even Massimo's former schoolteachers were calling. Angelica, are you okay? We saw David's posts. What's going on? I wouldn't answer. With every call, the humiliation deepened. The constant reminders of David's betrayal became unbearable. That's when I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I contacted a lawyer and arranged a meeting with David. On the day of the meeting, I waited for him at our old favorite cafe, the divorce papers laid out in front of me. When David walked in, Katerina was hanging off his arm. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her face was thickly made up, shining unnaturally, and she giggled at something David whispered in her ear. He approached the table, pulling out a chair for her with exaggerated chivalry. Well, if it isn't the old ball and chain, he said with a fake smile. Katerina, darling, meet Angelica. My first wife. Katerina looked at me with pity, a look that made my blood boil, but I stayed calm. I placed the papers on the table. I have the divorce papers here, I said evenly. I'm not asking for much. Just the house. You can keep everything else. To my surprise, David took the pen without a single objection. Fine, he said with a slight smirk, signing the papers. Keep your little house. I've got bigger and better things now. He turned to Katerina, his voice disgustingly sweet. Now I can finally be with someone I truly love. Someone I truly deserve. I gathered the papers, my hands trembling slightly. As I walked out of the cafe, his mocking laughter echoed behind me. But I didn't look back. The next day, I filed the divorce papers. Handing them to the court, I felt something lift off my shoulders for the first time in a long while. I could finally breathe again. Life has a remarkable way of delivering justice when you least expect it. Justice came to me in the form of a headline that spread through the local papers: Local business tycoon's empire collapses. Nephew left with massive debts. It turned out that Uncle Robert, shortly before his death, had taken out a significant loan to fund an ambitious project. He had mentioned it during our visit to the hospital, but at the time, Massimo and I hadn't grasped the scale of it. Now everything became painfully clear. The project had failed, leaving behind nothing but mountains of unpaid bills. From a distance, I watched David's new life crumble. He was forced to sell the factory, the mansion, the cars, everything he had taken so much pride in. Even that wasn't enough to cover the debts. He was left owing nearly $1 million. The final blow came from his young fiancée. As soon as Katerina realized David wasn't the wealthy magnate he had appeared to be, she packed her things and disappeared from his life without so much as a goodbye. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a flicker of satisfaction. Karma had finally caught up with him. One rainy evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find David standing there. But he wasn't the smug man who had abandoned me for the illusion of wealth. His hair was disheveled, his eyes red, and his face hollow and desperate. "Angelica," he began, his voice trembling. "I was such a fool. I see that now. Please, can we talk?" Against my better judgment, I let him in. Over the next hour, he poured his heart out, telling me how he had lost everything and realized what truly mattered in life. "I was wrong, Angelica," he said, his eyes full of regret. "You were the only one who ever truly cared for me. The only one I ever loved." Then, to my complete astonishment, David got down on one knee and pulled a velvet box from his pocket. "Angelica, please give me another chance. Marry me again. Together, we can overcome anything." For a moment, I froze. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I laughed. At first, it was a quiet chuckle, but it quickly grew into loud, uncontrollable laughter, tears streaming down my cheeks. David's face fell. "What's so funny?" he asked, rising to his feet. When I finally caught my breath, I looked him straight in the eye. "Oh, David. Did you really think it would be that easy? You abandoned me when I needed you the most. You humiliated me, betrayed me, and now you're crawling back because you have nothing left?" His face darkened. "Listen here," he growled, standing to his full height. "This is my house too. I have rights." I remained calm. Walking over to a drawer, I pulled out our divorce papers and handed them to him. "No, David. You signed away any claim to this house. It's mine. Now leave, or I'll call the police." For a moment, I thought he might argue, but the look on my face must have convinced him otherwise. He turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I called Massimo and told him everything. My wonderful son, as always, supported me. "You did the right thing, Mom," he said. "I'm proud of you." Those words meant more to me than he could ever know. In the weeks that followed, I made several important decisions. The house, filled with memories, both good and bad, was no longer a place I wanted to live. I sold it and used the money to buy a cozy apartment in a lively neighborhood I'd always loved. Now, at 60 years old, I realized life is just beginning. I started traveling, visiting places David had once promised but never took me to. I took up painting, joined a book club, and even tried salsa dancing one evening. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of David in town. He looks older, worn down by his mistakes. Life didn't turn out the way I expected, but I wouldn't change a thing. Because now, for the first time in a very long time, I am truly, completely happy.